So, where were we? Ah yes, Fitzroy winning their first premiership in over 20 years, right at the end of World War II. Lovely. But also, not really. A loss to South in round 7 of 1945 sees the Gorillas, and I forgot they were still called that, at a 2-1-4 record. They only lose 3 of the last 10 but fail to make the finals. 1946 was a bit of a wash as well, but 1947 was promising. After a rough 4-4 start, the Gorillas only lost 2 of their last 10 to storm into the top 4. They heartily beat the declining Tigers in the semi.
I don't know, I think that's a bit dodgy, mate.
And found themselves a point up against Essendon in the prelim. It was early in the last quarter. Fitzroy's defence was missing Vic Chanter, a tough backman who will meet properly a bit later, with a dislocated shoulder. Without his presence, the ball was left with George Hoskins, who successfully passed it to Bert Harper. Problem was, Harper played for Essendon. He slammed through what would be his last goal for 3 years, and Fitzroy never recovered. They would lose by 13 and never come anywhere near this close to making the VFL Grand Final ever again. That was pretty much it. This would be Fred Hewson's last ever match with the Gorillas. The heart had departed the club, but much like the big dumb animal they were nicknamed for, it took them a while to process the killing blow. At the halfway mark of 1948, they were 8-1, and after playing all the other teams once, they were 9-2. They then went on to lose each and every one of their last 8 games, missing the finals. They completed another different way of wasting a season when they ended 1949 with more wins than losses and a percentage under 100. Outstanding. There was one man throughout this period who kept the silly ape team in finals campaigns that this team had no right to be a part of. Allan Ruthven. He was the next skipper after Freddie, but he'd been around a while. Signed up as a 17-year-old as a city's own recruit, he'd always been talented, so much so that the Gorillas gave him the jersey number last worn by one Haydn Bunton. They called him the Baron, either after the Governor-General or Baron Rothschild after he came to training wearing a fancy hat. So off the field he was a ritzy bitch, but on the field the 173cm Baron played like a damn titan and was only prevented from being the Gorillas' greatest ever rover by, well, his predecessor being the actual GOAT. He was pacey, moved well, was an early adopter of the handball, and precise in front of goal, basically a refined, if not slightly less skilled overall version of Bunton. Hardly surprising, since Ruthven had grown up watching and idolising him. The Baron was certainly a better goal kicker, leading scoring from the midfield in 1944 and also winning the best and fairest in a Premiership side at the age of 22. He also won both titles the next season. 1946 was a disappointment, only winning the best and fairest. He won nothing in 1947, but gained the captaincy from the retiring Hewson in 1948. Like Fred, he won the BNF in his first year as captain. Unfortunately, he lost the captaincy the next year. To be fair, it was to Norm Smith, whose leadership took the Barons game to another level. He won a best and fairest that year too. No one was surprised. His performances gained the attention of various country teams, Hamilton offering £18 per week to play up there, with Broken Hill offering him $35. Fitzroy were only able to pay him around $6 at the time thanks to the Coulter law. The Gorillas blocked the transfers to Ruthven's disappointment. To his credit, our man kept his focus on his footy, and the next year was his greatest. Sadly, 1944 and 1945 Brownlow counts didn't take place, but in 46 Ruthven polled 16 votes, good enough for 5th, but after that he rarely caught the eyes of the umpires. 1950 was a different story. He polled in 10 of his 17 matches, storming home to win the medal by 3 votes.
This is my boy!
This was the pinnacle. Even though he regained the captaincy in 1951, his game deteriorated, potentially as a result of taking coaching duties over from Norm Smith when he left for Melbourne. One final highlight was in the 1952 semi-final when the Barons scored the go-ahead behind that won the match. This was to be the highlight of the 1950s by quite some way. Not that there weren't cool moments, there were. For example, round 10, 1952, Brunswick Street. The Gorillas, sorry, keep forgetting they're called that, host Essendon. Fitzroy's fullback is Vic Chanter. You remember him, he was a halfback when we first met him, but he got moved after, and this is true, the Gorillas' regular fullback got hurt when a window fell on him in the club rooms. I love this club so much. Vic's a tough customer, known for being highly aggressive in his man-marking play, so much so that opposition fans would spit on him and throw bottles and debris his way. But today he prepares for an even more unpleasant experience, the toughest task any fullback would have to face. Peak John Coleman. We've been through this before. 98 games, 538 goals, second most goals per game of any VFL player all time, way more than anyone who's even remotely within his era, got the leading goal kicker medal in the league every season he played where he didn't suffer a career-ending injury, with said medal being named after him, and maybe the best player the game has ever produced. So much so that he's the only VFL AFL legend who's played under 100 games, and in fact is the only one that gets anywhere near that 100 game mark. Vic knows just how tough an opponent Coleman is. In fact, he'll tell you as much. Coleman scored a goal in every single match he ever played. Except this one. Vic Chanter became the only man to ever hold John Coleman to nothing. Well, not nothing, 2 behinds the great man scored. One was basically on the final siren to a chorus of Bronx cheers, perhaps the only time that Coleman ever received those ironic cheers. Tony Ongarello got 5 up the other end to power Fitzroy to a remarkable victory. Ironic, really, if you know anything about Tony Ongarello, which, judging by my audience analytics, you absolutely don't. Supremely athletic, graceful to watch, he would have been a footy icon if only he could kick straight. AFL tables really is his best friend, because if they had behind stats back then, well, he'd look like the VFL's Travis Cloak. By his own admission, he just wasn't hitting it right, and he'd lose his head quite quickly. In one match against Geelong, he'd missed quite a few. He had to change something, and he did. He becomes perhaps the first man in 30 years to attempt a place kick in a game of football. Kicking from the flank, it was ambitious, but thanks to a bit of help from Norm Johnston on the line, it went in. He did the same thing again, and same result, even putting the Gorillas up in a close one that they only lost by a point. It worked briefly, but eventually suffered from the same result that had affected his drop punt. He packed it away, becoming the last dedicated place kicker in VFL AFL history. Only a handful of place kicks have been recorded by VFL AFL players in non-official game situations since. We had a few kickoffs, as well as a Don Scott howler, a Bernie Quinlan poster, and an Alex Jesselenko goal in the 1996 Centenary Legends game, and Paddy Cripps goal in 2019 in some weird thing called AFL X? Never heard of it. Oh, fun fact, Maurice Rioli performed a flick pass in that 1996 game. That was the last time that was ever done legally. It's unrelated, but I'm having fun out here on this tangent. Why won't you join me? No? Okay. Well, now for something completely different. I'm just going to briefly jump in here and skip to 1953 briefly because, of course, something weird happens. Round 10, we're at the Western Oval, and overnight there's simply been a barrage of rain, even by Melbourne standards. Now, the Fitzroy players had all attended a wedding in the morning, and there's a rumour that they thought the game would just be called off. It wasn't. The players rock up, and 3/4 of the ground is a standing lake. No, seriously, look at the pictures. I'm pretty sure that one of these guys is grasping for air, almost having drowned. George Coates would say that the drain blockages were caused by the Geelong overpass construction. You can see it vaguely in the background there, and estimated the flood depth was 10 to 15 centimetres. The newspaper estimates it was 8 inches. That's like 4 times the length of my dick. Jack McGregor jokes that he was picked at centre half forward, where I'm standing, the most flooded bit, because he was the best swimmer. Charlie Sutton nearly killed a man because he bumped him unconscious, as per for Charlie, and the bloke fell face down into a puddle of water. Footscray were only percentage behind the Gorillas. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot they were called that for a moment. Anyway, they were behind them on percentage at that point, and the two were vaguely similar in quality, but the Dogs absolutely went to town. At three-quarter time, they were up by 53 to 0. The second and last score of 0 after 3 terms in the league's history. And yes, of course, the other one was 1890s to 1900s. St Kilda, how could it not be? That same side also possessed the lowest ever score in the league of 1 in a game where that was the first score, by the way. So that 0 to three-quarter time game happened in a different game. God, 1890 St Kilda were just so fun. And 94 minutes into the 100-minute game here in 1953 at the Western Oval, the big dumb monkey team was still beneath that mark of 1. Allan Ruthven wouldn't accept that. Now, what happens next has been a bit muddied by history with 2 different versions. According to Harry Meese, the ball was just sitting on top of a puddle, probably fucking floating. And according to the Argus of that week, a source I'm very inclined to trust, ruckman Ken Ross palmed it toward the ground. Either way, the next part is the same. Allan Ruthven, the Baron, dives in, swings a boot at it in hope, and it rides a very literal wave through the goalmouth. Fitzroy avoids being the only team to ever be kept scoreless in VFL AFL history by 6 minutes. Yep, that's the amount of fingers that constitutes 6, losing 66 to 6. It is one of 11 scores of 6 or less in league history, and even discounting the 7 of those that belong to 1890 St Kilda, God, that team was so gloriously awful, Fitzroy's is the only example to happen in the 20th century. Of course, Richmond would be the final team to go goalless against, ironically, St Kilda 8 years later, and Fremantle would have a 1-goal showing in 2009 against Adelaide, a match I was very proud to be at, but no side has come as low since. Okay, that was fun. Let's rewind a bit. It's the end of the 1952 season. The lads are having a trip to WA to celebrate their most successful season in years. God knows why they picked Perth, but anyway. The boys are on the long train ride. Jesus, it's boring. Bill Stevens, current star player and future coach of the Gorillas. Sorry, again, I keep forgetting they're called that. Anyway, he gets to thinking, not that there's much else to do on this trip. He sees a piano in their carriage for some reason, and it sets off a train of thought?
That's not funny!
Sorry. He'd seen sides like Collingwood and North stir up crowds with their club songs, with Norths being adopted by the Victorian state side that Stephen had represented. So Stephen thought, what song could Fitzroy adopt? Well, Stephen had recently gone to watch Casablanca. For those of you who've never seen Casablanca, and I'm assuming that's all of you watching, it's a film based in World War II. One scene shows Germans occupying a restaurant and singing their Nazi songs. In a powerful protest, a lone Frenchman begins singing his national anthem. He is joined by more and more Frenchmen until they shout down the Germans. A song for a set of underdogs fought beaten to quell a dominant foe. Perfect. Until you remember that in real life France got dominated by Germany so hard you'd think that the Germans were wearing a leather mask and possessed a whip, but anyway. So Bill suggests it to the lads, and Kenny Ross loves it. The fighting song, he called it. I mean, France had surrendered at the point that the film was set at, but anyway, Stevens engineered the first line and then asked for input from all the lads to fill out the rest. A sense of community and camaraderie, or what's a better word? Fraternity. Yes. Again, perfect. It took about 10 minutes to write, leaving them dazed to sing the song literal thousands of times on the way back. People were so easily amused back then. The French embassy weren't exactly pleased at the bastardisation, wondering why exactly some pesky sports club had picked their beloved anthem. Stephen explained that it was a tribute, and that was it. Well, his actual words were "stuff the French," so that was good enough. The song that would get Fitzroyites through some awfully tough times had been penned and is still sung by Fitzroy in both of their current iterations to this day. Real classy and real cool, until you remember at this point on the train here they're still called the Gorillas. It's ironic that Fitzroy adopted a song made for the Napoleonic Wars and referenced by a World War II film because unfortunately the Gorillas are on a very short list of entities that really didn't benefit from the war ending, and that's not really a list I'd like to be on. It basically consists of them, Argentina, and Emperor Hirohito. Players returned from both the war and the VFA. Melbourne and South were allowed to use their home grounds after they stopped being occupied by American forces, and that's not a joke, and Geelong were able to get their players back after finally being allowed to travel with the lifting of the more extreme fuel rationing policies. Jock McHale retired, allowing Fond's kind to instil a fresh philosophy onto a Collingwood side that entered the 1950s as the most dangerous team in the league, whilst the astute recruiting of Ron Barassi and the hiring from Fitzroy of Norm Smith as coach meant that Melbourne exited the 1950s as the best team to have ever existed to that point. Fitzroy, well, they were about to enter a horror recruiting patch. Across every single player to debut for the Gorillas in the 1950s, 13 of them played 100 games or more, 13 of 96. Melbourne had 20, with 3 of those converting to double centuries compared to just 1 Roy, from only 87 debutants. But the Gorillas' figures weren't bad, they ranked just above average. But their next few years were worse. In the years of the 60s, not governed by country zoning, another 92 new Roy boys were christened. 5 made it to 100, with our lads the only side to not have a double centurion walk through the door. Fitzroy fell from the 4th best recruiters to the 3rd worst. At least they weren't South though, I mean, Jesus.
The lack of quality players coming through from their own zone was troubling. Fitzroy had been Melbourne's first suburb and consequently the first area zoned as its own borough. This made it an extremely popular place to live for many years as it was close to the city and had a well-established reputation. But as Melbourne's industrialisation had shifted from the inner city to its outer suburbs during the interwar years, it vastly changed the areas in which people lived. The establishment of the Housing Commission of Victoria in 1938 meant that soon a lot of affordable housing started cropping up elsewhere on the outskirts of town. People left Fitzroy in droves to move to places like Essendon, Frankston, Collingwood and Hawthorn, which, unlike Fitzroy, were bigger in area and weren't hemmed in on all sides by already existing development. The clubs from these areas greatly benefited from the increase in population to their zones, both in membership and in player bases. At the same time, European migrants were emigrating to Australia, desperate to move away from cities ruined by the Second World War. The suddenly vacant Fitzroy domiciles appealed greatly to immigrant families, as it was close to the city and to business opportunities mainly on the vibrant Brunswick Street. The suburb's proximity to Chinatown also encouraged high amounts of Asian settlement. 42% of the population of the area in 1947 was born outside Australia. Now, all of this is great. Ethnically diverse neighbourhoods provide a great variety of experiences and viewpoints, which is to be encouraged. However, this came at the cost of a lack of established football knowledge and talent growing up in or living around Fitzroy, as all of a sudden 2/5 of the suburb didn't know what Australian rules football was. From this point, the suburb also experienced downsizing, with the population decreasing from around 30,000 to just under 18,000 by the mid-1980s. Talent was becoming harder to find, but it certainly wasn't impossible to find a gem in the rough.
Fitzroy have had 4 16-year-olds play for them. The first, Les Gibaud, played 10 games in a 1918 side that really didn't do much of anything. Andrew Cougar did even less. An incredible 192 centimetres at just 16 years 46 days, the youngest player the Gorillas would ever field made one appearance as an unused 19th man, not even receiving a playing number. Gary Pert is the third. You'll hear more of the ferocious defender in the next couple of parts. But as good as he was, neither Pert nor any other Fitzroy player could hold a candle to the final 16-year-old, a lad by the name of Kevin Murray. Murray was oh man, do I have to say it? He was a gorilla through and through. His brothers played in the reserves, whilst his dad, Dan, played in the final Gorillas triumph in 1944 alongside the great Allan Ruthven. A lot of Fitzroy fans thought they'd never see a player on that sort of level again, when Ruthven retired in 1954. In 1955, all they had were memories of Haydn Bunton, and they'd soon need to cling extra tight to those memories. Unfortunately, we need to take a quick tangent that you're not gonna like. By 1955, Bunton had settled down in South Australia. That's not the bad news, but that's still coming. Haydn Jr. was already tearing it up in the seniors for North Adelaide, and Senior was living the quiet life as an insurance adjuster, and a damn good one at that. He also did some writing for the Sporting Globe. He was in talks to coach St Kilda, replacing their revolving door of coaches at the time, and he was planning to bring Junior onto that playing list. Today, though, he was coming home with a bunch of country produce. Haydn usually bought extra groceries whenever he was travelling to donate to the less fortunate. That was Haydn Bunton Sr., always looking out for the little guy. He'd always done it because that was who he was. A slight bump dislodges a carton of eggs, causing it to fall. Bunton catches it, shifts it to a more stable place, and while he's distracted, a tyre blows. Bunton's car smashes through two trees, tearing foot-long boughs from them before slamming into a third. The car is destroyed, and Bunton is lucky to be conscious, let alone alive. He suffers nasty head injuries. His collarbone is fractured, as are a selection of ribs, some of which have punctured his lung. Before the age of phones, it takes time for his wreck to be discovered on a remote road well north of Adelaide. He survives the impact, even battling through the pain to chat jovially with a policeman, but his injuries are severe. This isn't like last time, where a slow-moving car fell on a young man who just shrugged it off. This was a head-on highway crash at a time where there were no speed limits. This kills normal men, and although Bunton was no normal man, it would kill him too. He wishes his son luck for the last game of the season a day later. Junior, who'd almost had a massive crash of his own, hurrying to see his dad, plays his last game of the season the next day. 2 days after that, a blood clot that had formed around Senior's injuries ended his life. He was 44. Bunton hadn't played at Fitzroy in 13 years and hadn't played meaningful time in nearly 20. But the football world still stopped when his heart did, and his club still died a little bit. Tributes poured in from around Australia. Not only did every club in the SANFL send tributes, but so too did WANFL, VFL, and even countrysides as far out as New South Wales, even if the VFL refused to do a minute's silence before the next round of games. I guess they were finals, of which Bunton only ever played 2 of, so fair. His boss took the weird step of saying how good he was at making money for his company. Guess he was good at everything, really. Austin Robertson, Vic Johnson, Keith Miller and Percy Beams all wrote loving tributes and testimonials. Our old friend Doug Nichols, now of course a celebrated pastor, officiated at a heartfelt memorial service, farewelling the one man who transcended his time and made a lonely Aboriginal man feel at home in a place where society had strongly discouraged it. At the service were a dizzying array of the footy world, including Chicken Smallhorn, North Spearhead Jock Cordner, Hawk Star Bert Hyde, Harry Beitzel's dad, and even Jack McMurray himself. The Sporting Globe struck a medal in his honour to the paper's perceived most valuable player. He was survived by sons David and Haydn Jr. Jr. only a couple of years ago had been lined up by Fitzroy. Sr. desperately wanted to see his son in his own number 7 jersey, but his death meant the pair never moved to Victoria. Junior would have a successful career in his own right, winning a Sandover and nearly becoming the first and only person to win a Magarey as well. In a career that saw him inducted alongside his dad as inaugural AFL Hall of Famers, winning 3 consecutive Lantville flags for long-time battlers Swan Districts before going to his dad's old club in Subiaco and twice giving them long overdue glory. Like his dad, he would coach in 3 different states, but sadly never Victoria, and never for the club that his dad had loved so dearly. Bunton had also received high praise from Allan Ruthven, who'd filled his place as the next star for the Roys, but had recently retired. Now, with no Haydn, no Barron, and a floundering list, someone had to become that next star. Kevin Murray filled that void, and then some. Remember when I said that Fitzroy always had an elite, legendary player on their list? It really is true. Here's the timeline to prove it, with Hall of Famers in gold, mere Brownlow and Coleman medal winners in silver, Victorian or Australian captains in Victorian blue, and regular old multiple premiership winners in maroon. How poor those players are. McShane begat Worrell, then the Graces, McSpearin, Jim Sharp, Gerald Brosnan, the twin Percys, Trotter and Parrott, Creek, Moriarty, Bunton, Hewson, then Ruthven. And as soon as he left, in comes Big Kev. He'd been around the club since the age of 13, training with the thirds under Len Smith, his dad's former teammate, who'd been happy to bring him in. As a kid, he was taken under the wings of guys like Ken Ross and Alan Gale, who taught him valuable lessons about the game early. He spent a season in the backline, forming a great crash and run partnership with Colin Davey, before just absolutely exploding when brought on the ball. He wasn't the classiest or flashiest of players, but he had pace, judgment, and one hell of a leap. Don't believe me? Well, just ask none other than Lou Richards. He started off skinny but bulked up to become an imposing presence both offensively and defensively. He won Fitzroy's Best and Fairest in 1956, and 1958, and 1960, 61, and 62. Oh, and 1963. Upon winning his 7th Best and Fairest in 1964, he left for East Perth, where he not only won another Best and Fairest, he won a Simpson Medal for being best of field for WA in a state game. In fact, when he earned an All-Australian nod in 1966, he became the only man to do so for 2 different states, having done so for the Vics in 1958, although I'm sure Bunton would have done the same if the honour had been around more often in his time. The WA captain came back to Victoria and Fitzroy in 1967, not only becoming the Victorian captain as well, but winning the Best and Fairest in 1968 and 1969, that's 9 Best and Fairests for those counting along at home, whilst being as popular as ever. The 69 one was special though, not only because it's the funny sex number, but because he also won this. Remember our old buddy Harold Bray?
My boy!
From the Saints series? Well, this is another reminder that he should be in the Hall of Fame, but I bring him up because he had a rotten Brownlow luck, and Murray was no different, losing by 1 vote in 1960 to John Schultz, then coming a distant second to Alistair Lord of all people in 1962, and 3rd in 1968 with a couple other top 6 finishes. The 1969 medal was a close count, one that, based on past trends, Murray would have lost. But he outlasted Barry Davis and George Bissett to win by a single vote, becoming Fitzroy's first Brownlow winner since that man Ruthven. Now, I could talk all day about what a player he was and his style of play and, whatever, but if you really want to know Kevin Murray, all you need to know is where he was when he won his medal. The other fancied players were at a fancy do held by the league or off doing their own thing. Our man Kev decided to go along to a fan dinner held by the Fitzroy coterie, and when they found out he won, oh boy, did they go mad. Kev stayed humble though, even in his speech, apologising because now he had to leave to do the media commitments and, get the medal. But he'd be back, he promised, and indeed he was. The lads paraded him through the streets that night in jubilant triumph. He was the new Bunton. In teams starved of success, he won a Brownlow, carried his midfield, won medals, and played at the top level in both Victoria and WA, and bled maroon and blue. Everyone loved him, everyone wanted to be him, everyone wanted to beat him. Very few did, even in his final games, wearing a back brace at the age of 36. But he often had to fight alone. The players he took the field with were largely nowhere near his standard, and it showed. Fitzroy entered the 1950s on the fringes of the top four. But as the 50s wore on, they trended ever downward. Sure, they broke water to make finals a couple of times, but never won one. They finished second to a powerful Melbourne on percentage in 1960, but got spanked by those demons in the semi. A narrow prelim loss to Collingwood, sparked by Pies cult hero Ken Burns, broke them. Within 3 years, they claimed their first wooden spoon since 1936. And here's where things get really interesting. Of course, a lot got made of that North Melbourne side that won one of about 30 games across the 2023 and 24 seasons, including by me, and then there was this Eagles record that the West Australian used to torch their own reputation, and I used to make a name for myself. But 1960s Fitzroy were new measures of awful. Round 8, 1962. Fitzroy beat Melbourne. That's Ron Barassi and Norm Smith Melbourne, mainly by being super accurate in a game where if Melbourne had merely kicked like shit instead of like Billy Frampton after a bleach binge, Fitzroy would have been destroyed. This match, incidentally, was almost ended early because a rascally youth scampered up to the timekeeper's office and rung the bell with 8 minutes to go. On ya, Quasimodo. Now, this kid had nothing to do with what would come next, but we love grandiose names on this channel and facetious causes and effects, so allow me to cast upon a Fitzroy side that's only 2 wins out of the top 4. The Curse of the Bell Ringer! They would lose the next 8 games. A win against a miserable Hawks side that would still finish above the Roys that season begat a 10-match slide. They were last, 0-9 halfway through the 1963 season, and they had to face Geelong. Man, there's a lot of thunder out here. The Cats were on fire. A 14-win season the year before had seen them fall just short of a grand final, a fate they would avenge in a few months' time from now by winning their final premiership of the 20th century. They had stars everywhere. Polly Farmer was the best ruckman of the day and potentially of all time. Doug Wade would remain their leading goal kicker until a man they called God would dethrone him. Alistair Lord had just polled 27 Brownlow votes in an 18-game season the year before, and Bob Davis was one of the finest minds in football. Meanwhile, the Gorillas were fielding more teenagers than players with even 20 games worth of experience. And all of this is difficult enough without Kevin Murray, their captain coach, and star rover Graham Campbell absent in Adelaide on interstate football duties. However, the Cats would be without Davis, Lord, and Wade. Yes, names like Goggin, Devine, and Wooler were well known, but they didn't strike fear into you like Wade, who would go on to score 1,000 goals, and Lord, a recent Brownlow winner. Never mind what happened to his career afterward. So while the Cats were a more experienced side than the Roys, they didn't really actually have a huge amount of experience on the park. Only 6 players with 50 games experience and only 3 who'd kicked more than 20 goals. The Roys, though, were seen as such outsiders that no radio station in Melbourne even sent a team to cover the game. It just wasn't worth it to see a burgeoning empire go up against a side that was getting abused by everyone, from Richmond to St Kilda to the bloody puppet that turned up for Sunday drinks. Stand-in Roy's coach Wally Clark could see this. He was a smart man, perhaps best exemplified in a battle with Big Murray Wiedemann in his playing days. Rather than get lamped, he cleverly curled up on the floor, very astute. Anyway, the night before the game, he called up his boys and met with them, giving them a very specific game plan. Clark knew that conditions would be extremely poor. The rain would be coming down sideways, turning Brunswick Street Oval into a mud pit and parts of Victoria into actual swimming pools. As reserves coach, he knew the ground well and how it played. He told his boys to attack on the drier side of the ground and force the Cats to attack on the wetter wing to spoil the Cats' superior ball handling skills. Attack in pairs, boys. Use the handball where you can. Keeping the ball will be easier this way. God, old Haydn Sr. would be proud. He emphasised the importance tackling would have on such a day. He then said, boys, their best players, Hamer, Farmer, Polinelli and Sharrock are all left-footers. Attack them from the right. Corral them, hem them in. And speaking of Farmer, he's played nearly 200 senior games and is basically already an AFL Hall of Famer, although that is to be established after my own death, and I have no way of foreseeing such an institution, boys, but Gaz has adopted a second-person narrative device using me, Wally Clark, as the narrative voice, but wants to impart future information. Anyway, he's a legend, and our rucks played 3 games, and let's be honest, Roy, you're a bit shit. Anyway, Brian, this is where you come in. I brought you in specifically to get in the way of Farmer at ruck contests, and despite the fact that you are taller than him, I will use Roy to get the head out, although in future you will claim that it's actually you who are getting the head out, and media reporting on this game is very, very spotty, boys, as none of the journalists actually want to be here, as we've well established, because they think that we're a cat up against gorillas, and once again I'm using the second-person narrative device to impart things that I don't understand personally being here. But anyway, I'm playing with 2 rucks, which will undo the very innovation that this club and its very best player ever began. I'm fucking crazy! And they knew it would work. Ward Stuckbury, the Fitzroy secretary, who will also play another vital role in this story in a few moments, well, he was in WA with their state team and had decided to do some scouting of Polly Farmer's old stomping grounds. He learned to his delight that this very tactic had been used by Swan Districts to great effect in Polly's last Waffle Grand Final, said tactics mastermind being none other than the great Haydn Bunton Jr. To make sure the message got through, Clark gave another talk to his boys on the morning of the game, doing so in front of as many Roy's fans as he could, which was in direct opposition to what Murray's usual MO was. Brian Clements, the key part to this operation, says that this element really helped impress Clark's words upon the team, Clark clearly showing more determination than his opposite number. Not Bob Davis, who was coaching that Big V side, but Neil Tresize, a name you might remember from my VFL history series, with a very, very brief mention there. Attacking to the wind-assisted end where their right flank was drier, which suited them, Fitzroy's Gary Lazarus, man, that is a fitting name, scored 2 goals, while Max Myers, not related to Gryan, scored a 3rd. Geelong scored 6 behinds only. Even when Geelong had the wind, they failed to make the most of their chances. Our mate Wally, at the big break, once again spoon-fed inspiration to his boys in front of the Roy's faithful, and it paid off. Lazarus again scoring 2 goals with the wind, contributions from Hayes and McRae giving the Roy's a 38-point lead with 1 turn to go. Clark's plan to double-team Farmer had worked, Clements and Fry sharing the sort of chemistry out there that only housemates could. You can't really say that this was the finest hour of Brian Clements' career, as his career only lasted about 15 minutes. This was the exact halfway point of a 23-game spell which produced few highlights and even less wins. But 50 years later, he still gets goosebumps even thinking about Wally Clark's halftime speech, revelling in dominating perhaps the greatest ruckman of all time. For all that, and for the game being remembered now almost solely for the efforts of him and Fry in nullifying Farmer, neither were named in the best players list in the Sporting Globe. Centre halfback David Sykes and flanker Brian Pert got the 0 votes. Brownlow votes weren't given whilst the state games were on, so even if he was named in the best, Clements was robbed of the only Brownlow votes of his career. The last term was a formality, the Cats only shaving 2 points off the gap to end at 36 points back, a gap bigger than the score they'd generated. Geelong scored one less goal than Gary Lazarus by his lonesome, and doesn't he like to remind his foes of that? It was the Wally Clark masterpiece, literally, as he never coached another senior game. Every player interviewed about this game, though, has dedicated the victory solely to the coach who stepped in at the last minute. In fact, Farmer was so pissed off about the tactics he didn't even shake the hand of the kid who beat him. The fans carried the victorious Roys off the muddy ground in triumph. After all, this broke a 17-match losing streak. Unfortunately, this would begin a 27-game losing streak, which also encompassed the entire 1964 season, the last winless season any team would experience in the VFL-AFL, until, I'm assuming, Essendon in 2026. Their next win in round 2 of 1965 came after Murray had left for East Perth, with Bill Stephen now in charge, meaning the only win in Murray's 2 seasons in charge was actually coached by Wally Clark. Murray's coaching tenure wasn't just one of only 12 coaching tenures of 10 games or more with a winning percentage of less than 1 in 8, but one of only 4 of those to contain 0 wins at all. Of those 4 to span across multiple seasons, Murray and another future Fitzroy coach I'll introduce you to some ways down the line. Murray's winless tenure was almost double the length of the next longest. Poor guy. Meanwhile, the loss sparked a cat's crisis meeting that itself sparked a 90% win rate over their next 10, leading to their final flag for 44 years. But it didn't matter. That 1963 day would always be remembered. The Lions were victorious. Wait, Lions? Well, yeah. By the late 50s, the gorilla had stopped being a wild animal in the eyes of some and become shorthand for something subhuman. The fans mostly hated it. Bill Stevens says it was used less by Fitzroyites and more by their opponents as it became an insult, almost derogatory. Fitzroy received scorn and laughter now from opposition fans, something that would have been outrageous to think of even 15 years ago given their fearsome reputation. The name, even though it may have been an apt description of what Butch Gale looked like on the field, had to go. In comes our hero, the Fitzroy secretary, a lad by the name of Ward Stuckbury. What a name. Being called gorillas and apes, he cries at a committee meeting. I'm sick of it. I think we should have a new name. So he and Bill Jacobs have a chat after the meeting and try and brainstorm. Potentially inspired by Coburg, who were using the name at the time, Jacobs goes, okay, how about the Lions? Yeah, that's the one. So in 1957 they threw away the gorilla identity and replaced it with something properly aggressive in a noble and courageous way, an animal that would represent the club's emphasis on fighting to the last, never giving up, never saying die. The Lion Rampant. This, though, wasn't a favourite of the players. The Lion Rampant was too British, too, what's the word I'm thinking of? No, not that one. Okay, George.
George, you are so bad!
Anyway, it wasn't them. In 1965, they went to the committee and said, hey, let's change this. The Lions should spark fear in the hearts of our enemies, especially because with our play right now, we're not doing that. George Coates commissions a mate to draw something different, and potentially taking the same inspiration Holden had, they came up with perfection. This is the business. Better than that constipating, missing his literal ass, car-hocking pussycat. This was strong, fierce, always rolling that ball forward, ready to strike. It was the perfect representation of what would follow over the next few decades, never giving in, no matter the odds, no matter the overwhelming amount of peril, fighting to the end to secure their future. And every time you thought you had them beat, well, they'd absolutely maul you. Well, like every third time or so. And they'd need every bit of that lion spirit, because the midpoint of the 1960s would see them lose their biggest star and their home.